Episode 32, Empires, Migration, and the New Imperialism, an AP European History podcast by Hammer History Productions. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Casey, your host, and today we're tackling a big subject: the global impact of 19th century European migration and imperialism. This is when millions of Europeans moved across oceans, and when European powers carved up much of Africa and Asia. To guide us, I'm joined by Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo. Dr. Morgan, what's the big picture here?
Thanks, Casey. The late 19th century was a period of enormous change. Industrialization fueled population growth, new transportation allowed people to travel long distances, and global markets drew people and goods together. Europe became more connected to the world than ever before. But it wasn't just about trade and technology, it was also about power. Industrial nations competed for colonies in what's often called the new imperialism.
And Professor Theo, what will you focus on?
I'll be emphasizing the lived experience. How did migration shape families and communities? How did imperialism affect colonized people? And how did Europeans imagine themselves in relation to the rest of the world? We'll see that it was not only soldiers and rulers who were involved, but also ordinary men, women, and children on every continent.
Great. Let's start with migration because that seems more hopeful. Dr. Morgan, what drove millions of people to leave Europe?
Between 1815 and 1932, more than 60 million Europeans left their homelands. That's staggering. It's like emptying out entire countries. This global mass migration was fueled by both push and pull factors. Push factors included overpopulation, unemployment, and persecution. Pull factors included land, jobs, and the promise of freedom abroad.
Where did they mostly go?
Many migrated to what historians call the Neo-Europes, settler colonies that resembled Europe in climate and culture. These included the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Latin America. Think of the Midwest in the U.S. or Argentina's plains, filled with immigrant farmers from Germany, Italy, and Eastern Europe.
Could we break down some groups? For example, I know the Irish left during the potato famine.
Yes, the Irish are a classic case. After the Great Famine of the 1840s, when potato crops failed year after year, more than 1 million people died and millions more fled. Many went to the United States, where they settled in cities like Boston and New York.
Italians were another huge group. From the 1880s to 1914, millions left impoverished villages in southern Italy. Some went to the U.S., others to Argentina and Brazil. But unlike the Irish, Italians often practiced return migration. They worked abroad for a few years, saved money, and returned home.
So, not everyone stayed permanently.
Exactly. Migration wasn't always a one-way trip, it was part of a cycle.
What about Eastern Europeans?
Jews fled pogroms, violent attacks in Russia and Eastern Europe. Many went to the U.S., but some also to Britain or South America. Germans and Scandinavians, meanwhile, often moved to the American Midwest to farm, bringing their cultural traditions with them.
It sounds like Europe was sending people all over the globe, but wasn't it also taking control of more of the globe at the same time?
Exactly. While millions were leaving, European states were also expanding their control abroad in what's known as the new imperialism.
How is that different from the earlier imperialism, like Spain and Portugal in the 1500s?
That's an important distinction. The imperialism of Spain and Portugal in the 1500s was primarily settler colonialism. It involved mass relocation of Europeans to the Americas, where they displaced or outright destroyed indigenous populations through conquest, forced labor, and disease. This was an era of genocide and demographic collapse for native peoples, as well as the transatlantic slave trade that uprooted millions of Africans. By contrast, the new imperialism of the late 19th century wasn't mainly about transplanting Europeans to new lands. Instead, it was about asserting political, economic, and cultural control over existing societies. Industrial powers often ruled indirectly, exploiting resources, markets, and labor while keeping most local populations in place. It was less about replacing people and more about dominating and reorganizing them under European authority.
And it's worth adding why Europeans pursued this. Profit was at the top of the list. Industrial economies craved raw materials and new markets. But nationalism also played a huge role, since colonies were seen as symbols of prestige and power. Missionary groups pushed to spread Christianity, believing they had a duty to convert non-Europeans. And underlying it all was the racist belief in European cultural superiority, the assumption that Europeans were destined to rule over less advanced peoples. These motivations combined to fuel the aggressive expansion we call New Imperialism.
That reminds me, is this connected to Kipling's poem, The White Man's Burden? I've heard that phrase used before, but I'm not totally sure what it means.
Yes, exactly. Kipling wrote that poem in 1899, urging the United States to take up colonial rule in the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. He described empire as a noble but heavy duty, the burden of Europeans or Americans to civilize supposedly lesser peoples. It captured the mindset of the time that imperialism was not just about profit or power, but also framed as a moral mission. Of course, in reality, it often meant exploitation, racism, and violence, but the poem shows how cultural justifications were woven into the politics of empire.
That's when they divided up Africa, right?
Yes. In the 1880s, the scramble for Africa began. To avoid fighting each other, European powers held the Berlin Conference in 1884-85. There, they agreed on rules for claiming territory. But, and this is crucial, no African leaders were invited. Europeans drew borders on maps without considering local peoples.
That seems really unfair.
It was. The consequences were devastating. Boundaries cut across ethnic groups and traditional kingdoms, sowing divisions that still cause problems today.
Were all European powers involved?
The main ones were Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy. Belgium's King Leopold II claimed the Congo Free State as his personal colony. Under the guise of philanthropy, his administration brutally exploited Congolese labor to extract rubber and ivory. Millions died from overwork, famine, and violence. One reason Europeans were able to dominate so quickly in Africa was technological advantage. Quinine made it possible for Europeans to survive in regions once devastated by malaria. Steamships and later railroads allowed faster travel inland, while the telegraph gave colonial officers instant communication across continents. And perhaps most decisive was the Maxim machine gun, which gave European armies overwhelming firepower in battles against African forces.
And we shouldn't overlook steamships, railroads, and the telegraph. Steamships could carry troops and supplies quickly up rivers like the Niger or the Congo, where sailing ships struggled. Railroads, often built with local forced labor, pushed deep into continents, allowing resources like minerals or crops to be extracted and exported. The telegraph meant a colonial officer in Africa or India could send a message to London or Paris in minutes rather than weeks. Together, these tools gave Europeans enormous logistical advantages.
I know what steamships and railroads are, but what exactly was quinine? And why was the Maxim gun such a big deal compared to older weapons?
Quinine was a medicine derived from the bark of the cinchona tree found in South America. Europeans discovered it could prevent and treat malaria, which had been a deadly barrier to colonizing parts of Africa. With quinine, European officials, soldiers, and settlers could survive in areas where they once died in large numbers.
And the Maxim gun represented a revolution in firepower. It was the first fully automatic machine gun invented in the 1880s. Compared to rifles or muskets, it could fire hundreds of rounds per minute with little effort. In battles, a small European force with a Maxim gun could defeat much larger African armies armed with spears or older firearms. This imbalance made conquest far easier and deadlier.
Is this when Europeans actually decided to carve up Africa?
Yes, right after these technological shifts came the political agreements. In the 1880s, European leaders launched what's called the Scramble for Africa. To keep themselves from fighting each other, they convened the Berlin Conference of 1884-85. There, representatives from the major powers, Britain, France, Germany, Belgium, Portugal, and Italy, agreed on the rules for claiming African territory. Crucially, no African rulers were invited, so decisions were made without the input of the people who actually lived on the land.
For Africans themselves, the Berlin Conference was devastating. Their lands and communities were treated as bargaining chips, and borders were drawn that ignored existing kingdoms and ethnic groups. Yet it's important to remember that Europeans did not succeed everywhere. Ethiopia, under Emperor Menelik II, managed to modernize its military and defeat an invading Italian army at the Battle of Adwa in 1896. This victory preserved Ethiopia's independence and became a powerful symbol across Africa that European domination could be resisted.
What about South Africa? I've heard of the Boer War.
The Afrikaners, or Boers, were descendants of Dutch settlers. When gold and diamonds were discovered in the region, the British wanted control. This led to the South African War, also called the Boer War, from 1899 to 1902. It was a bitter conflict, with guerrilla fighting in the veld and civilians caught in the crossfire. The British eventually won, but they used concentration camps for civilians, where many women and children died. The war also set the stage for the creation of the Union of South Africa in 1910, which united British colonies and former Boer republics under a system that gave power to the white minority while excluding the black majority from political rights.
Why did the British and Afrikaners agree on a system that left out the black majority? It seems like they were the ones who made up most of the population.
The British and Afrikaners, despite fighting bitterly against each other, ultimately shared an interest in maintaining white dominance. They feared that granting political rights to the black majority would threaten their economic and social control. So, when the Union of South Africa was created, they compromised with each other while uniting to exclude Africans from power. This laid the foundation for decades of racial segregation and inequality that would eventually harden into the system known as apartheid in the 20th century.
What about Asia?
Asia faced a different kind of pressure. In China, the issue of opium became central to European intrusion. Britain faced a trade imbalance because it imported huge quantities of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, while China wanted few British goods in return. To fix this, British merchants began selling opium, grown in British India, to Chinese buyers. This was illegal under Chinese law, but enormously profitable, and the British government protected the trade because it balanced their accounts and enriched the empire. When Chinese officials tried to crack down on the drug, Britain responded with military force. The First Opium War broke out in 1839, and Britain's naval power quickly overwhelmed China. Afterward, the Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced China to cede Hong Kong, pay a large indemnity, and open 5 ports to British trade. This not only weakened China's economy, but also exposed the corruption and weakness of the Qing dynasty, undermining its legitimacy. A few years later, the Second Opium War, 1856-1860, brought more humiliation. China was compelled to open even more ports, allow foreign envoys in Beijing, and legalize the opium trade itself. Together, these defeats contributed to political collapse within China as officials lost authority, and internal rebellions like the Taiping and later the Boxer Rebellion gained strength.
How did this all affect ordinary Chinese people? Was opium really that widespread? And what did these defeats mean for daily life in China?
For ordinary Chinese families, the impact was devastating. Opium addiction spread widely, draining households of money and productivity. The defeats also meant higher taxes and more foreign interference in local affairs. Politically, the Qing dynasty looked weak and corrupt, unable to defend its sovereignty. Chinese people later referred to this era, beginning with the Opium Wars, as the Century of Humiliation, a period of foreign domination and internal crisis that shaped national memory for generations. The resentment from these defeats eventually fueled uprisings like the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, when Chinese nationalists tried to drive out foreign powers by force, though the rebellion was ultimately crushed.
That phrase, the century of humiliation, really helps me understand how deep the wounds were. It wasn't just about lost battles, it was about ordinary lives being disrupted and a whole nation feeling powerless. So, when historians talk about gunboat diplomacy, is that just another way of describing what Britain was doing during the Opium Wars, using its naval power to force China into unfair agreements?
Exactly. Gunboat diplomacy meant that European powers used their naval strength to impose their will on weaker states. Britain did this in China during the Opium Wars, but other examples include forcing Japan to open its ports in the 1850s or threatening the Ottoman Empire when debt payments were at risk. In every case, warships standing offshore sent the message that refusal could mean bombardment.
And India?
India first came under British influence through the British East India Company, which gradually expanded control over the subcontinent during the 18th century. The company built alliances with local rulers, exploited divisions between Indian states, and raised its own private armies. By the early 19th century, it controlled vast territories, collecting taxes and dictating trade. What made this especially significant was that India had once been among the wealthiest regions of the world, contributing a huge share of global GDP in the 1700s. In fact, India and Britain were not far apart in levels of production at the start of the 18th century. But company policies deliberately undermined Indian industries like textiles, favoring British manufactured goods instead. This deindustrialization drained wealth from India and funneled it into Britain, turning a former economic powerhouse into a colony dependent on foreign rule. This private corporate rule laid the groundwork for later unrest. In the long term, resentment built up as Indian farmers and artisans were taxed heavily and local industries were undermined by British imports. In the short term, the company's growing tolerance of Christian missionaries alarmed many Indians who feared their traditional religions were under attack. The final spark came with the introduction of new rifle cartridges, rumored to be greased with pig fat and beef fat, deeply offensive to both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. Resistance exploded in the Great Rebellion of 1857, sometimes called the Sepoy Mutiny. Indian soldiers, or sepoys, revolted against the British East India Company. The rebellion was crushed, but it forced Britain to take direct rule over India, turning it into the crown jewel of the British Empire.
After 1857, life under the Raj changed in many ways. The British built an extensive railway network, partly to move troops quickly, but also to transport raw materials like cotton and jute to ports for export. New schools and universities were established, teaching in English and creating a small class of Indian elites trained in Western ideas. But this education was not offered equally, and most Indians remained poor farmers or laborers. Socially, rigid racial segregation marked daily life. British officials lived in separate compounds, social clubs were closed to Indians, and marriage between Europeans and Indians was strongly discouraged. The benefits of modernization were unevenly distributed, deepening the inequalities created under colonial rule.
What about Japan?
Japan took a different path. After centuries of isolation, it was forced open by the United States in the 1850s, when Commodore Matthew Perry arrived with a fleet of warships and demanded that Japan allow international trade. Shocked by the superior military technology on display, Japanese leaders realized they had to modernize quickly or risk colonization. This led to the Meiji Restoration in 1867, when the emperor was restored to power and sweeping reforms began. Leaders modernized the government, created a constitution, introduced compulsory education, built factories, and reorganized the army along Western lines. By the 1890s, Japan had become an imperial power itself, defeating China in 1895 and Russia in 1905. These victories astonished Europeans and showed that modernization wasn't exclusively European.
Japan's rise also set the stage for its growing imperial ambitions in the 20th century. It expanded into Korea and parts of China, and by the time of World War I, it fought alongside the Allies. Later, in World War II, Japan would pursue even more aggressive expansion across Asia, showing how the reforms of the Meiji era ultimately reshaped global power balances far beyond the 19th century.
Were there rivalries among the European powers themselves over empire?
Yes, imperialism often brought Europe to the brink of war. A key example is the Fashoda incident in 1898, when British and French forces confronted each other in Sudan. Diplomacy prevented war, but it showed how dangerous imperial competition could be. Later, crises in Morocco in 1905 and 1911 further heightened tensions, especially between Germany and France.
So imperialism was connected to the causes of World War I.
Exactly. Colonies became both sources of wealth and flashpoints of rivalry.
What about the cultural side? You mentioned Orientalism earlier.
Yes. Orientalism is a term scholars use to describe how Westerners stereotyped Asian and Middle Eastern cultures as exotic, backward, or childlike. Art and literature often depicted colonized peoples this way, which reinforced the idea that Europeans were superior and had a civilizing mission. It was a powerful cultural justification for empire that reached into novels, paintings, and schoolbooks across Europe.
Did everyone in Europe support imperialism?
Not at all. Some socialists, like Karl Marx, saw imperialism as a way for capitalists to distract workers from inequality at home. Later, Lenin wrote Imperialism, the highest stage of capitalism, arguing colonies were essential for capitalist survival. Liberals and humanitarians also criticized imperial abuses.
So there was debate within Europe itself.
Yes. And empire shaped everyday life at home, too. Tea, coffee, sugar, and tropical fruits became household staples. Children's books and school curricula celebrated imperial adventures. At the same time, immigration from colonies, like Indians in Britain or Algerians in France, began to diversify European societies.
That's fascinating. So empire was everywhere, in politics, in food, in culture.
Absolutely. And this was visible in world fairs and exhibitions that celebrated empire. In places like London and Paris, visitors could stroll through displays of colonial products, reconstructed villages, and technological marvels meant to showcase European dominance. Popular adventure novels like King Solomon's Mines and travel writing fed the public's imagination about far-off lands. At the same time, critics such as J.A. Hobson argued that imperialism primarily benefited a small group of financiers and industrialists, while ordinary Europeans paid the costs.
What about Egypt? Where does it fit into this story?
Egypt is a textbook case of Western intervention driven by debt, strategy, and the Suez Canal. In the early 1800s, the ruler Muhammad Ali tried to modernize Egypt's army and economy. His grandson, Khedive Ismail, pushed even harder with grand projects, most famously the Suez Canal, which opened in 1869. But these projects were wildly expensive. To cover the costs, Egypt borrowed heavily from European banks.
So when the bills came due, Europe stepped in?
Exactly. By the mid-1870s, Egypt was deep in debt. In 1875, the British government bought a controlling share of the Suez Canal Company to secure the route to India. Soon after, Britain and France imposed a system called dual control, taking charge of Egypt's finances to make sure European creditors were paid first.
Egyptians felt humiliated. Their country's budget was being run from London and Paris. Officers, students, and peasants rallied behind Colonel Ahmad Urabi, whose movement demanded Egypt for Egyptians. In 1881-1882, unrest grew into a nationalist uprising against the Khedive and foreign domination.
Is that when the British occupied Egypt?
Yes, one in 1882. The British Navy bombarded Alexandria and sent troops to crush the Urabi revolt, claiming they were restoring order and protecting the canal. They promised the occupation would be temporary, but Britain stayed. From then until World War I, Egypt lived under a veiled protectorate, officially Ottoman, but effectively run by British officials.
Daily life reflected this new reality. Lord Cromer, Evelyn Baring, the top British administrator, reshaped the economy around cotton exports and irrigation works. Revenues went first to debt payments, and spending on Egyptian-run schools or industries was limited. Many Egyptians saw improved canals and railways, but also heavier taxes and little say in how the country was governed. Perfect ingredients for rising nationalism.
And how did Sudan and nearby regions fit into this?
British control of Egypt pulled them south into the Nile Valley. They faced the modest uprising in Sudan and eventually reconquered it in the 1890s. That campaign, culminating at Omdurman in 1898, showcased modern weapons like the Maxim gun and it set the stage for the Fashoda crisis with France that we discuss shortly.
So Egypt shows that empire wasn't only about grabbing resources, it was also about securing routes and controlling debt.
Right. Egypt tied together all the threads of new imperialism. Strategic choke points like Suez, financial pressure, military force, and the rhetoric of order and civilization. It also nurtured a new generation of nationalists who would press for independence in the 20th century.
Exactly. By 1914, Europe dominated much of the globe. But that domination created tensions and resentments that would erupt in the world wars and in decolonization movements of the 20th century.
This has been a lot. Migration, scramble for Africa, opium wars, Meiji Japan, resistance, Orientalism, and rivalries. What's the main takeaway?
Europe's global power reached its peak in the late 19th century, but it came at immense cost.
And we should remember both sides, the opportunities migration created and the suffering caused by imperialism.
Thanks, Dr. Morgan and Professor Theo. That's all for today's episode of The Once and Future Present. Join us next time for episode 33, when we'll be exploring competing interpretations about the motivations for British imperialism.